So I'm going to give you a little bit of background to what came out of Durban in the negotiations. There was obviously Durban was much more than just the negotiating meeting, and then I'm going to focus on what I really do both here in my professional work at ERC and in the negotiations mitigation, and certainly Guy's going to add on adaptation, and Richard, I imagine, will have something to say on finance. So was Durban a success or a failure? And I've blogged about this in the tradition of using the social media. And what I thought afterwards, I actually came out of Durban not as depressed as I thought I would. But it really depends. It depends on what your measuring stick is. If you assessing the climate change negotiations, as we all should, by what the climate needs, it was a miserable failure. There's no doubt. We're on track. We continue to be on track. We're kind of embedding ourselves to a pathway towards 3.5 degrees. There's political rhetoric about 2 degrees, keeping temperature increase below 2 degrees, or maybe 1.5 above pre-industrial levels. Nowhere near. And you'll see why. The mitigation targets are much too weak. If you measure it against what was politically possible, it was actually quite strong, and particularly as the negotiations dragged not just into past Friday night, but into Saturday night. There were several times during those hours where many of us on the negotiating team, and particularly the South African negotiating team, just felt this was all going down the tubes because it was a package, and I outlined the big elements of that package just now, and it looked like it was just all going to disappear, and we were going to go to Qatar next year, and it will all end in the sands of Qatar. And it could have been a really total failure, and so compared to that, it was actually felt quite good. But certainly then, again, another sort of true academic fashion, qualifying that again, it wasn't a big bang breakthrough. It wasn't a big, a massive movement forward. There was no big agreement reached. But it had some very important, some of the shifts that were taking place very slowly are quite big, and I think quite significant. But to start with the first part, it was clearly the outcomes of Durban, not enough to stop climate change. Parties essentially said, well, we set targets politically in Copenhagen, we nailed them down into decision text in Cancun, and we're not going to change them now, particularly the US articulating that very strongly. Maybe for targets after 2020, but not now. Poor balance in mitigation commitments by developed countries and actions. And overall, I thought there were many reactions, but WWF, I don't think Tasneem's here, but leading that team, saying this is really leaving people in the natural world that we depend on at risk, and that's true. Yes, we did agree of operationalization of a fund, but it's still empty. And there's just overall not enough action from parties. These are negotiations, the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework on Convention on Climate Change, as all the UN negotiations are, negotiations amongst nation states, and the willingness to do things is just not there yet. So what did come out? And this is the more political big picture. So there were 4 major outcomes, and this was really the shape of the package that started to emerge, and it started to emerge quite early actually in Durban. So the outcomes in the end were that there's a Durban platform to negotiate the future of climate change regime, and to negotiate that multilaterally. Very important. There was a big risk that if it had all gone down, the failure scenario, we really would have been in a pledge and review world. And to go to, well, I'll come back to these in detail. The second big piece is amending the Kyoto Protocol. Before Durban, the expectations were very much that we all knew that the future of the Kyoto Protocol was the big issue, the big political issue, whether it would completely end or not. Because if no second commitment period had been adopted, the first one simply ends at the end of this year, and there simply wouldn't have been time at the end of this year to quickly get it ratified from December to January. So it only contains the EU, and this morning Cheryl Lazinski was telling us that's only 15% of emissions, but it's there. A lot of detailed decisions, acronym ALERT, in the working group on long-term cooperative action, which I will from now on call the LCA, not that I'll explain it to you. A lot of detail, and some of that relates certainly to issues, adaptation, finance, technology, capacity building, a whole range of things. And then very important, and South Africa quite prominent in this, in operationalizing the Green Climate Fund. And overall, Durban did put us back on the multilateral track, and I'll tell you a little bit more why I think that's important. So on the first part, we agreed to negotiate a thingy by 2015, and advisedly used the word thingy, because this was a big issue in the second bullet point there, and it was really, I don't know if you saw this, but in the last big plenary meeting through, when was that, Saturday night, I think, Saturday afternoon, Saturday into Saturday night, there was this, one of the quite smart things that the South African presidency did is not send people to a small room and basically say to India, who was opposing the protocol or legal instrument, and others, the US and the EU who really wanted that, or not, sorry, not the US doesn't want a legal instrument, but the EU who really wanted that. It was really between Connie Hedegaard and the Minister Natarajan, if I never get that name right, from India, go into a huddle, and there was this big huddle in the middle of this plenary room, and 5 words really came out of that huddle, an agreed outcome with legal force. So what we've agreed now is to negotiate a new agreement by 2015 that will be a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force. And this agreed outcome with legal force, India really ideally would have wanted to see decisions there. This is slightly more than that, and as the Chinese lead negotiator quite smartly said, well, those are 5 years, it'll probably take us 5 years to agree what that means. And certainly the lawyers, Richard, will have a field day with interpreting more. Jan Blazewski, we are international environmental lawyers. What does that mean? Nobody knows. It's a little bit like, the first two are a little bit like the Berlin mandate, which was the negotiating mandate and that resulted in the Kyoto Protocol, which was clear that it would result in a protocol, and did so. And the last was compromise language, but critically, you can't, I don't think lawyers can read anything, but I don't think you can read agreed outcome with legal force and call that pure pledge and review, and that's a very significant step forward. There's a new working group, and some other way, I thought very cleverly called it the AW-GDP. It's really the AWG that's focusing all of those big GDPs, but that wasn't the intention. It's the ad hoc working group on the Durban platform. It's the negotiating group that's going to be set up now. Another very significant shift was that this agreement that will come into effect, it will be negotiated by 2015, it will come into effect post-2020. And any targets, commitments, actions will be for after 2020, but it will be applicable to all. Now, for a long time, since the convention was negotiated and agreed in 1992, we've lived in this north-south, again in climate change speak, Annex 1, non-Annex 1 world. So in Annex 1, all the developed countries are listed at the back of the convention, and it's been it's been trench warfare between the north and south, and now there is agreement, and this was also part of that huddle, to say, no, we will agree something that will be applicable to all. And so the contention between the US, which is seeking absolute symmetry and commitments from all, and particularly from China, and India and other developing countries who agree with a lot of merit say, no, we are still in a different situation. There still is differentiation. Differentiation may mean something different to what it meant in 1992. I agree very much with that statement. And yet, it is clear that we will now negotiate something. So the new regime that eventually, and I think it's clear there won't be a third commitment period of Kyoto, that will eventually replace Kyoto, will be applicable to all parties. Now, what will be in the negotiations over the next 4 years will reveal. So all of this took place in quite important, and I'm kind of going out of the outcome sequence here, just in case you're following my 1, 2, 3, 4. But I think a lot of this is explained by how much we could move and how little was possible by shifts in geopolitics. Overall financial crisis, Europe putting all its money into Greece, America just coming out of government almost being closing down. There was no money on the table. That's never good for a negotiation. We for a long time really struggled. We know that we need really urgent action, particularly on mitigation and adaptation, but we should have acted 10 years ago. It's really urgent now. If we draw those curves, It really needs to happen a long time ago, and yet what is politically possible, a gap between what the science tells us is required and what's politically possible is huge. And there's been no breakthrough politically in this context. The US, of course, remains really very difficult party in the negotiations. Not only have they not joined Kyoto and say they would never do anything like it, but they're increasingly pointing to China, and China's increasingly, and India, pointing right back at them. And if those three countries don't move, things essentially don't move. And so, without saying that it all depends on China, because that's not fair, politically it's becoming clear that the US is not going to move. And if you try to design a climate change regime around what the US will accept, two things will very likely happen. Firstly, you'll get a really, really weak, watered-down agreement. And secondly, quite likely in the very end, the US Senate will anyway not ratify, because they have a terrible track record of ratifying anything. So a lot depends. If China were to move, then India would follow, a lot of developing countries would follow, and maybe in the end, the US might actually shift its position. But we need to design things around more than the lowest common denominator. So when the Chinese Minister Xi in the media, about the middle of the meeting, about the beginning of the second week, made a statement, he named the conditions under which China would accept possibility of a legally binding instrument, all very caged language, after 2020, etc., with targets for larger development. That was a very important signal and did give the movement that there was. The other very important source of movement are coalitions emerging across this strong North-South, Annex 1, non-Annex 1 divide between very vulnerable countries, AOSIS, least developed countries, most of whom are in Africa, so a large part of the Africa group, and the European Union, which is really the only major bloc which is, to be blunt about it, really has targets with real environmental integrity. So a little bit getting into the mitigation part now and the future of the Kyoto Protocol. Thanks, Mark. I've mentioned the amendment, and that this was the last chance to save the Kyoto Protocol. Two major reasons why that's really important. The one is the targets themselves. So there are only quantified emission commitments that we have. But also, crucially, there's a set of rules that actually in detail accounts for them, and you measure progress against a target. This has been tried and tested for almost a decade now. And to actually have those in place while you're negotiating another agreement creates a very different situation. It effectively, again, creates a situation that's very different to a pledge and review approach, where countries just say, well, our target is different. And then there's a whole lot of detail that I'm going to skip now, because I want to not take too much time. Mitigation under the convention. The LCA, which I've explained, really is now going to come to an end. It's got one more year, and it's pretty clear that that mandate is not going to be extended more. On mitigation, unfortunately, developed countries really have stuck to very weak targets. We know from previous analysis that, we know from the last IPCC report, that there should be, for 2 degrees, there should be, have reductions between 25 and 40% by 2020 below 1990 levels. Roughly speaking, what's on the table is between 13 and 17%, depending on ranges submitted, and also if you really, for example, have very weak land use rules, there are all kinds of rules issues that play into those numbers, but the bottom line is they're really weak. And not only that, but they're targets for a single year. And what really matters are the trajectories. There was an absolute refusal by the US to convert their single year targets into a trajectory, into what we called targets into tons, trying to create little sound bites. And then, of course, you probably read in the media, Canada very shortly after withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol overall. Mitigation actions by developing countries, the best one can say about that, they're less unambitious. They're not exactly, can't bring myself to call them ambitious perhaps, but they're less bad, and they're closer to what's needed for 2 degrees, but still those numbers are brutal. And even South Africa is 34% below, deviation below business as usual, which I consider quite hard to do. And that is not enough to get us to 2 degrees. That of course depends on what everybody else does, but it's really, really challenging. And then, for those of you interested in detailed rules-based governance, there's the fascinating world of MRV, another acronym, measurement, reporting, and verification, but in plain language, transparency and rules for transparency. And that's where, it's one example where the Geopolitical protocol rules are so important, because we're reinventing quite a lot of things now, applying also to developing countries, on how we're going to measure, report, and verify actions and on mitigation, and also indeed finance. This is just a very quick list, and I'm just going to flash this up because there's a whole lot of other stuff. The last mitigation piece is the first one, a new market mechanism. This is non-trivial because this could be a much bigger market mechanism, significantly bigger than the clean development mechanism, the CDM, that many of you in this room would know. And a whole lot of other things that are not mitigation that I hope others will speak to. I'm going to highlight this topic because it's close to my heart. As you can see here, me sitting next to a Chinese colleague, Pan, from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and together with Stefan and a whole lot of people in the basic expert group, we did a whole lot of, this is a picture from a side event where we launched a publication on this topic, equitable access to sustainable development. Yes, what does that mean? Very good question. The point is that it reflects both equity in relation to a limited atmospheric space and equity in relation to development. And as Mark says, I very much believe that the way in which developing countries in South Africa addresses climate change and reducing emissions needs to take account of the development agenda and indeed the poverty agenda. This is now very much, and not because of this side event in our work, but in general part of the negotiation in several places. And there will be, in fact, a workshop in the negotiations. The Indians pushed this very strongly. And I think it's important because I think the negotiations fundamentally need to be rooted, as this last bullet point says, in science, in what we really need to achieve, and in equity. And that applies not only to mitigation, but also to adaptation and what we call the means of implementation, the finance, technology, and capacity building. So last few words, just where might this be going? Well, I do think that Durban was an important signal, an important shift to a more reciprocal regime, or a regime where I don't think the commitments for all parties will be the same, but a regime that will be, it's agreed now, applicable to all. I think there's been quite a lot of time talking about what is appropriate differentiation that isn't a bipolar, developing country world, but still not a homogeneous world. We will have our next meeting in Qatar, which is an OPEC country, and that will be interesting. And just the multilateral response is what I want to end with. I strongly believe that it remains crucial. If you negotiate in smaller forum, in small rooms, there is no protection for the weak. Weaker countries, never mind poor communities, get left entirely out. And the only real protection that we have at the moment is the multilateral process. It's also the only process that is really universal, and there's a lot of legitimacy in that. But, and as Mark said, I've spent a good close on a decade on these multilateral negotiations. So I say this with some sadness, but it's very clear, it's unambiguously clear that it's not delivering anywhere near fast enough. So we're going to have a relationship, I believe, between the UNFCCC, the multilateral process, and a whole lot of action at a whole lot of other levels that needs to be much more clearly defined, and that will lead us into what Richard always calls it. It's all about governance, governance, and governance. So I'll end there. Thank you.
One thing I've learned about these meetings is that you've got to wait for the dust to settle before you can really understand what happened. I don't know about you, Harold, but while things are underway especially, it's really difficult to see what shape is emerging from all these discussions. It's very, very complicated. And I think it sometimes takes months to even years to really understand how things have evolved while you were in the thick of things, and clarity emerges with time. But so I'm going to talk a little bit about adaptation, covering issues like SAFTA 35, the NWP, Decision 1 CP10, the AC, the GCF as it is under the GEF, the AFB, the SCCF, and the roles of the leg, especially with regard to naps and nappers. What's my score? Normally I'd have a nice presentation, but I'm just going to speak off these notes. So adaptation, just to give some context, and I'm sure most of you are well aware of this, is in a way it's mitigation's little brother in a sense, and has taken much longer to emerge in the negotiations as a significant, serious issue. Partly initially because I think there was a kind of a moral hazard seen in accepting that adaptation was needed. So if we accepted that adaptation was necessary, it kind of would reduce the pressure on countries to mitigate. So we, letting them off the hook. But that time is well past now, and it was at the Bali Action Plan that adaptation really started to take its role on the stage through the Cancun agreements, and now we have a very interesting emerging architecture on adaptation that came out of Durban, which is well worth just reflecting on. So, there are three kind of main areas I want to kind of highlight on adaptation. The first one is the emerging architecture of adaptation under the Framework Convention. The second is about funding and how that relates to adaptation. And then the third one is the science behind adaptation. And there were three, there was good progress, I think, in Durban under all those three elements. And we now have what looks to be an interesting emerging architecture under the Convention on Adaptation. One of the main things that has been agreed is this new body called the Adaptation Committee. The Adaptation Committee has long been argued for by developing countries because of concerns around the incoherence in adaptation. How do we do adaptation? Mitigation is a much more coherent thing to tackle. We have a goal, 2 degrees, which quantifies Article 2 of the Convention, which is to prevent dangerous interference. We're not fully happy with that goal yet, but at least it's a goal. So you can plan mitigation and you can assess whether or not there's a chance of it hitting the goal. But the adaptation goal is really quite weak actually. If you look at the Convention, all we've got to make sure of is that ecosystems adapt naturally within a time frame, that food production is not affected, and that economic development continues. So that's really it's quite a kind of a weak agreement. But in a sense, it opens up a very broad area for discussion. So not all bad. So this Adaptation Committee has been agreed, and it will comprise. I've actually forgotten exactly how many members, but I think it's at least 20, 10 developing countries and 10 developed. And the idea is, one of the big arguments against such a committee was adaptation is such a complicated process. How can we possibly have a committee that can cover adaptation? And finally, the developing world, I think, has won that argument. So we now have this committee. And more importantly, we have an agreement to decide a work plan on adaptation. So, I think this is a space well worth watching. What is going to emerge from an adaptation committee that's going to start working on how adaptation should unfold, how it should be funded, the linkages between the adaptation negotiations and other areas, particularly the science, and linkages between adaptation and mitigation. Another area that emerged under this is national adaptation plans for countries. So, especially for developing countries. So, we now have a process underway to define how countries should elaborate their national adaptation plans. And that is a very significant step forward. One of the big concepts behind this is that these national adaptation plans will be country-driven. But clearly there's going to be a pressure and an impetus on all countries to develop national adaptation plans. And this is, I think, a really interesting development. Because if you think about it, when you start planning adaptation to climate change, you're really talking about planning development at the same time. So now we have, under the UNFCCC, a formal process and a drive. Countries have signed on to this convention, so they're committed to it, to start developing national adaptation plans, which are going to be closely linked with development planning, and which will be funded through the Green Climate Fund and other funds. So this is probably going to be one of the big sources for development funding as we go forward. And I think this is a really interesting thing to think about. It's kind of an international game changer in a sense in the development space, potentially. So this I think is, you know, we often say that, you know, these conventions don't achieve very much, but if you get into the implications of some of these decisions, they start to really mean something. And as they're implemented, and the way that they're implemented, can result in some really big changes in the way that the world works, actually. So under funding, we have you know, the Green Climate Fund. Those negotiations were successful, and there is one of the tricky areas which is going to be discussed is this area of additional costs of adaptation. So when funding is made available to a country for adaptation, what does the country have to do to show that it will be investing that money in adaptation and not in something that it would have done anyway? This is going to be an interesting area of discussion, I think. And if you argue that development is what's needed, it's going to be quite difficult to tease out the development needs from the adaptation to climate change needs. So watch that space for how this evolves. Hopefully this is not going to slow down progress on adaptation, and countries have got their thinking caps on how to get around this. But the GEF, sorry, the Global Environmental Facility has been asked to provide some guidance and some insights into what this term additionality means in relation to adaptation. Finally, on science, I think we had some very nice progress on the science of adaptation under the Nairobi Work Programme. And the Nairobi Work Programme will continue for another 2 years and will initially focus on 2 critical areas. The first is water. So there's going to be a workshop on water and adaptation regarding water issues. And then another very interesting area, which is ecosystem-based adaptation. So the use of natural systems to help societies adapt to adaptation. And this, I think, is an interesting area for those of us interested in the way that we can use natural systems and enhance the value of natural systems to help people adapt to climate change. So I'm hoping that the nexus of sort of biodiversity and climate change is going to be well elaborated under those discussions, and there's a workshop on that scheduled before Substantive 38, as far as I remember, which is the end of this year. So yeah, I think that's basically what I wanted to say about adaptation, and thanks for listening.